Hello, this is a video about classes and structs in Swift and how they're two different things and they are useful for different situations. So the first thing I could talk about is the classic difference between value and reference types. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but if I set up a class which is a reference type, which contains a person, and I'll just have one property which will be the name of the person. So I'll need an initializer which will take in the name, which is a string, and then assign that to the property. So then I can set up an instance of that struct using the initializer and put any name in there. And then I can print the customer name. And it should come up with Dave as the name. Now if you set up a similar struct, exactly the same thing will apply. So I'll just use some commenting. Instead of a class, we'll make this a struct. And this is perhaps a thing that's not clear when using these, is it's exactly the same result. So let's start with the struct. When we make a copy of a struct, it's a value type, so it will genuinely be a copy. So that means if we have a second customer who is actually the same as the first one. So therefore, our second customer name will be Dave, because it's just a copy of Dave. So this is a value type, so when you assign second customer to be customer, it will be a copy of the customer. Therefore, if we change the customer name to be Phil, the second customer name, because it's a copy, will be unchanged and will still be Dave. And just for reassurance, we can check that our first customer name indeed has changed to Phil. With a bit of luck, yes. So this is Dave, this is Dave, this is our changed customer to Phil, and this is our original second customer name. So what will happen here with the class is something different. When we create the second customer, it references the customer rather than copying it. Therefore, our second customer will still reference the original one. This is what's called a reference type. So our customer name is Dave as before. Our second customer name is Dave while we don't make a change. So when we change the first customer, it becomes Phil. So that's unchanged. But the second customer becomes Phil because it's a reference type. It references the original type. So this is the difference between a reference type and a value type. Subclass, only for one type. So we could set up another customer. So we can have a class which is another customer, which is a customer. The only difference between the two is that the another customer has a superpower. And to avoid having to write an initializer, I'll just set the string naturally to nothing. Cannot find customer in scope. Whoops, person. So it'd probably be better to be consistent and have another person. So this should run. Nothing special is going to happen because I haven't set up an instance. But if we try to do a similar thing with our struct, subclassing isn't allowed. Therefore, and for consistency, I'll swap that class to be a struct, but it won't matter because what we're asking it to do doesn't make any sense. And this is the thing, when we talk about difference between classes and structs, you can't subclass a struct, you can only subclass a class. It's inferred by the name. You can only subclass a class. It's self-evident from the language we use. But it's a truism that subclassing will never work for the struct. Initializers. So there's a trick here, and that trick just involves you don't require the initializer there for a struct. You get a free member-wise initializer. So if I comment this out and try to do the same with the struct, we don't have that feature in a struct. So when we click play, then Swift will complain that I haven't set up an initializer. It's more of a thing than anything that makes it easier to code, but it's still a feature of the object that we create. The final one, view model, that I'm going to run over today is there's sometimes some confusion. Should you create a view model for MVVM as a class or a struct? So for both of these, I've set up a view model and set it up so it calls a function. Nothing particularly exciting. You can run through what MVVM is and how we should set up view models. But the point is, the second view model is a class. Well, I've done the same with the struct. This is actually basically the same, but I'm referencing a struct rather than a class. It still has the test function, and this runs in exactly the same way. So what happens is when it loads, it runs this test function and just prints to the console because that comes from the view model. So the question is, you have two very similar view controllers and view models. Which should you use within your code? For me, the answer is, theoretically at least, a view model can be used with multiple view controllers. That being true, you'd want to use a reference type for your view model, and the reference type is a class. So therefore, I would always use a class for my view model rather than a struct, even though in this very simple case, the result would actually be the same. There are other features of a class you'd probably want to use when creating a view model, but this for me is the winning argument. You can use a view model with multiple view controllers when using a class.